Diversity action plans to improve enrollment of participants from underrepresented populations in clinical studies. Guidance for industry. Section 1, Introduction.
This guidance is intended to assist sponsors conducting certain clinical studies involving drugs, biological products, and devices to meet requirements for the submission of diversity action plans under Section 505 (Z) and a Section 520 (G) 9 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. FD&C Act, as added by Section 3601 of the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act of 2022, FDORA. Specifically, Sections 505(z)(3) and 520(g)(9)(a) of the FD&C Act require that sponsors submit diversity action plans for certain clinical studies in the form and manner specified by FDA in guidance.
Diversity action plans are intended to increase enrollment of participants who are members of historically underrepresented populations in clinical studies to help improve the strength and generalizability of the evidence for the intended use population. Such plans must specify the sponsor's goals for enrollment in a clinical study, the sponsor's rationale for such goals, and include an explanation of how the sponsor intends to meet those goals. The Secretary is required to update or issue guidance to sponsors regarding the format and content of their diversity action plan pertaining to clinical study enrollment goals, disaggregated by age group, sex, and racial and ethnic demographic characteristics of clinically relevant study populations.
Section 3604 of FDORA also requires that FDA annually submit to Congress and publish on the agency's website a report that summarizes, in the aggregate, the diversity action plans received and whether the clinical studies conducted met the demographic enrollment goals from the submitted diversity action plans.
FDA is issuing this guidance to satisfy Section 3602 of FDORA, which requires that FDA update or issue guidance relating to the format and content of diversity action plans required by Sections 505(z) and 520(g)(9) of the FD&C Act. C. This guidance describes the format and content of diversity action plans, including the timing and process for submitting such plans by application or notification type.
Additionally, this guidance describes the criteria and process by which FDA will evaluate sponsors' requests for waivers from Section 505(z) or 520(g)(9) of the FD&C Act. This guidance also provides general recommendations for sponsors who may wish to publicly post key information regarding their diversity action plans. This guidance replaces the draft guidance for industry titled Diversity Plans to Improve Enrollment of Participants from Underrepresented Racial and Ethnic Populations in Clinical Trials, April 2022. This guidance is not intended to address all issues related to the clinical development of medical products, such as the design of clinical studies, clinical study endpoints, or the data necessary to support a marketing submission. Sponsors should refer to the appropriate FDA guidance documents for FDA recommendations on these matters.
Per Section 3602(c) of FDORA, the requirements for diversity action plans apply to clinical studies for which enrollment commences after 180 days from the publication of the final guidance. Because sponsors engage in study planning and implementing study activities prior to when enrollment commences, FDA does not expect a diversity action plan to be submitted for clinical studies where the following circumstances are present.
Clinical studies of drugs with protocols submitted within 180 days following the publication of the final guidance, where enrollment is scheduled to begin 180 days after publication of the final guidance. Clinical studies of devices received by FDA in Investigational Device Exemption, IDE applications within 180 days after publication of the final guidance. Clinical studies of devices that do not require an IDE application to be submitted to FDA that are approved by an Institutional Review Board, IRB, or Independent Ethics Committee, IEC, within 180 days after the date of publication of the final guidance.
In general, FDA's guidance documents do not establish legally enforceable responsibilities. Instead, guidance describes the agency's current thinking on a topic and should be viewed only as recommendations, unless specific regulatory or statutory requirements are cited. The use of the word should in agency guidances means that something is suggested or recommended, but not required.
An exception to this framework derives from the requirement in Section 3601 of DORA for FDA to specify in guidance the form and manner for the submission of diversity action plans. Accordingly, insofar as Section 7 of this document specifies the form and manner for submission of a diversity action plan, it will have binding effect once this guidance is finalized, as indicated by the use of the words must, shall, or required.
Follow Diversa Trials on LinkedIn, YouTube, and your other favorite social media platforms. Also, be sure to check out our other FDA DAP draft guidance videos. Thanks for watching.